The sun was a white-hot music hammer, beating the life out of the Wyoming plains. Silas Music Thorne felt the crushing weight of the world on his shoulders. His daughter, May, was a small, heavy bundle pressed against his aching back. She was only 4 years old. Her breath was shallow and jagged. Her skin felt like a branding iron against the nape of his neck. Silas had been walking for 3 agonizing days. His boots were worn through. Every clear's throat step tore at the raw skin beneath them. He squinted at the horizon, searching for a miracle. The year was 1888. The great die-up of the previous winter had been a massacre. Millions of cattle had perished in the suffocating snow. Silas was a man who had been stripped of everything. He had lost his farm in Nebraska to the black clouds of locusts. He had lost his beloved wife, Sarah, to the relentless grip of the fever. All he had left was May. She was his heartbeat, his only reason to take the next step. In the shimmering distance, a small ranch house flickered like a mirage. A woman stood there, perfectly still. She wore a blue dress that matched the terrifying vastness of the sky. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. She watched his staggered approach with eyes as hard as flint. Silas stopped at the very edge of the dust-choked yard. He did not want to scare her. A man with nothing is often seen as a man who will take anything. He reached up with a trembling hand and tipped his sweat-stained hat. "Good afternoon, Mom," he croaked. His voice sounded like rusted hinges grinding together in the wind. The woman did not move a single muscle. She scanned the man before her. He was a ghost draped in the grime of 1,000 miles. She looked at the small limp girl strapped to his back. May's eyes were tightly shut. Her tiny pale hand gripped the frayed collar of Silas's shirt. "You're a long way from nowhere, stranger," the woman said. Her voice was steady and sharp. It held the granite strength of a woman who survived on her own terms. "I'm looking for honest work," Silas said, his legs shaking. He took one agonizing step forward. "I can mend any fence the wind can knock down. I can break the wildest horses you've got. I can do anything you need, ma'am." He paused, his throat closing up as he looked at his daughter. "I don't need much in the way of coin, just a corner for my girl to rest her head, and a bit of milk to keep the life in her." The woman stared at him, searching for the truth in his eyes. She looked at his hands, calloused and bloody from the journey. She noticed the way he shifted his weight to shield the child from the sun. A heavy silence stretched between them, thick as the heat. The wind whistled through the dry, dying buffalo grass. It was the loneliest sound a man could ever hear. "My name is Clara Higgins," she finally whispered. Silas nodded, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest. "Silas Thorne, ma'am. From Nebraska." Clara stepped off the porch, her movements graceful yet weary. She walked toward him, the dust swirling around her hem. She didn't look at Silas's desperate face. She looked directly at the child. May opened her eyes just a sliver. They were dark, clouded by the heat of the fever. They were filled with a terrible wisdom that no 4-year-old should possess. Clara reached out a trembling hand. She touched May's forehead with the back of her fingers. "She is burning up," Clara whispered, her voice finally softening. "Yes," Silas said, his heart twisting like a knotted rope. "She's been fading since we left the last watering hole." The Clara looked back at Silas. Her expression was a mask of unreadable iron. "I don't need a ranch hand," she said coldly. Silas felt his stomach drop into a bottomless pit. His knees buckled and the world began to spin. He started to turn back toward the empty horizon. "Wait," Clara called out, the word cutting through the air. He stopped, his breath hitching in his chest. She looked him square in the eye, her gaze piercing his soul. "I don't need a man to fix my fences, Silas Thorne, but I have a requirement, a price for the milk and the bed." Silas waited, his pulse drumming in his ears. He was ready to sell his soul to save his child. "I want a daughter," Clara said, her voice cracking for the first time. The words hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. He gripped the leather straps of May's carrier until his knuckles turned white. "Mom?" he asked, his mind reeling. He prayed he had misheard the madness in her voice. "You heard me," Clara said, her chin lifting in defiance. "I want a daughter to fill this empty house. Not to replace what you've lost. Never that. I only want to love her as if she were my own. If you stay here, that is the cost of your survival." Silas felt a surge of primal fear. Was she trying to buy his flesh and blood? Was this the cruelty of the West finally claiming his last treasure? "I won't give her up," Silas growled, his voice low and dangerous. His protective instincts flared like a wildfire. "I'm not asking you to give her up, you fool," Clara said. She looked back at the hollow, silent ranch house. "I'm asking for a family. I'm asking for a reason to draw breath in the morning. The winter of '87 took my husband, Ben. It took my hope and buried it under 10 feet of ice. It took the children we dreamed of, but never held." She stepped closer, her eyes brimming with a sudden, sharp pain. "You want a job and a life. I want a daughter to love and a legacy to keep. You stay here, you work this land until your hands bleed into the soil. But you let her be mine too." Silas was in a state of profound shock. He searched the woman's face for any sign of malice. He saw only a deep, aching loneliness that mirrored his own. It was the shared language of the broken. "She needs medicine, Clara," Silas said, using her name for the first time. "I have herbs and willow bark in the pantry," she replied. "And I have a feather bed that hasn't been slept in for a year." Silas looked down at May. The girl's face was flushed, a terrifying shade of crimson. He had no choices left. "All right," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We stay. She is yours to love." Clara didn't smile, but the tension left her shoulders. "Bring her inside, quickly," she commanded. The house smelled of cedar, beeswax, and dried lavender. It was clean, quiet, and felt like a sanctuary. Clara led them to a small, sun-drenched bedroom. The bed was covered in a magnificent handmade quilt. It was a mosaic of colorful scraps, stitched with love and patience. Silas gently lowered May onto the soft mattress. The child groaned, a small, pained sound that broke his heart. Clara was already moving with purposeful grace. She brought a basin of cool, clear spring water. She began to bathe May's face with a linen cloth. Her movements were incredibly tender. They were the ancient movements of a mother tending to her own. Silas stood in the doorway, feeling like a ragged intruder. He was a man of the trail, a creature of dirt and sweat. This room was a holy place, and he was covered in the world's filth. "Go to the barn," Clara ordered without looking up. "There's a cot in the tack room. Wash the trail off yourself at the pump. I'll bring you a bowl of stew once she is settled." Silas nodded and retreated into the fading light. When Silas disappeared into the darkness, Clara closed the bedroom door. She sat beside May. For the first time in over a year, she cried without making a sound. The cool water at the pump felt like a baptism. He scrubbed the layers of Nebraska and Wyoming from his skin. He thought about the bargain he had just struck. It was a strange, beautiful, and terrifying pact. In the Wyoming Territory, life was a brutal currency. People did horrific things just to see the next sunrise. But this felt different. This felt like the birth of something sacred. That night, the wind howled like a banshee across the plains. 3 times before dawn, Clara changed the cold cloth on May's forehead. Twice, May's breathing grew so faint that Clara leaned close in fear. She prayed until her knees went numb. Silas sat on the edge of the narrow cot in the barn. He ate the beef stew Clara had brought him. It was rich, salty, and filled with the warmth of a real kitchen. It was the first time his stomach hadn't been cramped with hunger in weeks. He thought about his wife, Sarah. She would have loved the way the stars looked out here. They were so bright. They seemed close enough to touch. He felt a single hot tear roll down his weathered cheek. He wiped it away with the back of a scared hand. Men on the frontier were told that tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. But the loneliness was a weight heavier than any mountain. The next morning, the sun rose in a blaze of gold and violet. Silas walked to the main house, his heart thumping. He found Clara in the kitchen, bathed in the morning light. She was carefully feeding May a few spoonfuls of broth. The girl looked different. Her eyes were clear, and the fire in her skin had died down. She broke the fever in the middle of the night, Clara said. She didn't look up, her focus entirely on the child. Thank God, Silas breathed, leaning against the doorframe. You'll find the heavy tools in the shed, Clara said, her voice businesslike. The north fence was trampled by a stray herd. Start there. Work until the sun sets. Silas went to work with a ferocity he hadn't felt in years. The labor was grueling and the heat was a constant enemy. The ground was dry, stubborn, and packed hard as stone. But it felt magnificent to use his muscles for a future. It felt holy to have a purpose that wasn't just walking away from a grave. As the weeks passed, a rhythmic peace developed on the ranch. Silas worked from the first light of dawn until the stars emerged. He repaired the sagging barn and reinforced the corrals. He dug a new well, hitting a vein of water that tasted like life itself. He tracked down the remaining cattle and nursed them back to health. And in the house, Clara took over the world of May. She taught the little girl her letters, using a charred stick on the porch. One evening, Clara quietly mended the torn sleeve of Silas's work shirt. She never mentioned it. The next morning, he noticed the careful stitches. He smiled for the first time in years. May looked up and laughed. Mama fixed it. She showed her how to gather eggs without breaking the shells. She sang old haunting songs to her in the purple twilight. Silas watched them from the shadows of the barn. He saw May laughing, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. He saw her cheeks turn a healthy, vibrant, rosy pink. He saw her follow Clara around like a devoted shadow. It hurt him in a quiet, selfish corner of his heart. He felt like he was losing the only thing that belonged to him. But then he saw the joy in his daughter's eyes. He saw that she was finally, truly safe. And his own shattered heart began to knit itself back together. One afternoon, a group of riders appeared at the front gate. They were men from the nearby settlement of Medicine Bow. They looked at Silas with narrowed eyes and deep suspicion. "Who are you, stranger?" One of them barked. He was a mountain of a man with a rusted tin star on his chest. "I'm the ranch hand," Silas said, standing his ground. "Since when does Clara Higgins hire drifters?" The sheriff asked. "She's been a lone widow since Ben passed in the ice." Clara walked out onto the porch, her jaw set in a hard line. May was tucked safely behind the folds of her blue skirts. "He's with me, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice like a whip. "He is a good man and he works harder than any three of you." The sheriff narrowed his eyes, leaning forward on his saddle. "Folks in town are talking, Clara," the sheriff said. A couple of men behind him laughed. One spat into the dirt near Silas's boots. "Hard talk," the sheriff continued. "A lone woman and a nameless drifter living under one roof. It don't look right. It don't sit well with the decent folk." Silas felt his face flush with a hot, righteous anger. He wanted to pull the man off his horse and demand respect. But he knew the cruel reality of the world. A woman's reputation was her only currency in a land of men. "He is my partner," Clara said, her voice ringing across the yard. The sheriff looked genuinely stunned. "Partner? Or is he something else to you, Clara?" "That is none of your business and certainly not the law's," she snapped. The men exchanged dark, knowing looks. They didn't like her tone, and they didn't like her independence, but they had no legal reason to stay on her land. "Just watching out for your interests, ma'am," the sheriff lied. They turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust. The dust settled, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Silas looked at Clara, his heart heavy with guilt. "I should leave, Clara," he said quietly. "I am bringing nothing but trouble and shame to your door." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. She looked at the daughter she had claimed as her own soul. "You aren't going anywhere, Silas Thorne," she said firmly. "Let them wag their tongues until they fall out. They don't know what it's like to be an empty vessel." Silas walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom step. "Why did you really want a daughter, Clara?" he asked. It was the question that had kept him awake in the tack room for months. Clara sat down on the top step, looking out at the horizon. She smoothed the fabric of her blue dress with trembling fingers. "I had a daughter once," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas froze, the air leaving his lungs. Her name was Rose. She was 3 years old. She died during the terrible winter of 1886. The wood ran out. The coal was gone. The cold was a beast that crawled through the cracks in the walls. I held her against my chest until she went cold in my arms. Clara's voice didn't shake, which made it even more devastating. But the agony in her eyes was a hole that could swallow the world. "I promised God I would never love another living soul. It hurts too much to lose them when the winter comes. But then I saw you coming up that trail. I saw a father who would walk through hell for his child. And I saw a little girl who was fading for lack of a mother. I didn't want to buy her, Silas. I'm not a monster. I wanted to save myself from the silence." Silas felt a massive lump form in his throat. He realized in that moment that they were exactly the same. Two broken, jagged pieces trying to find a way to fit together. He saw the dignity in her grief and the courage in her demand. The weeks turned into a golden, crisp autumn. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek turned to shimmering gold. The memory of the big die. Up was still a shadow over the territory. People were bracing their spirits for another brutal winter. The tension in the town of Medicine Bow continued to fester. The rumors about the widow and the drifter grew more poisonous. Some said Silas was a killer hiding from the law. Others said Clara had finally lost her mind to the prairie madness. One Sunday, they decided to face the world together. They needed heavy supplies to survive the coming snows. Silas drove the wagon, his back straight and proud. Clara sat beside him, her head held high. May was in the back singing to a rag doll Clara had sewn. As they pulled into town, the air turned cold with judgment. Women whispered behind lace fans, their eyes like needles. Men spat into the dirt as the wagon passed by. Silas kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He felt the crushing weight of their small-mindedness. They entered the general store, the bell ringing like an alarm. The owner, Mr. Miller, was a man with a face like curdled milk. He served Silas with a heavy, insulting silence. Clara walked to the back to look at the winter wools. She wanted to buy the best fabric for a new coat for May. A woman in a silk dress approached her, her smile fake and sharp. It was the mayor's wife, a woman who thrived on the misery of others. "Clara," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity, "we are all so terribly worried about your situation. Living out there on that isolated ranch with that man." Clara didn't look up from the bolt of wool. "I am perfectly fine, Martha. Mind your own house. But think of your reputation, dear. And that poor stolen child. She should be with proper, Christian people." Clara stopped touching the fabric and turned slowly. "That child is loved with a ferocity you couldn't imagine," Clara said. "She is fed, she is warm, and she is cherished. Can you say the same for the orphans living in the alleys of this town?" The woman gasped, her face turning a vivid shade of purple. She turned on her heel and scurried away like a frightened beetle. Silas finished loading the heavy sacks of flour and grain. He wanted to leave before the tension snapped into violence. But as they tried to pull away, their path was blocked. A group of men stood in the middle of the dusty street. The sheriff was at the center, his hand resting on his holster. "Thorn," the sheriff yelled, his voice echoing. Silas pulled hard on the reins, his heart hammering. "What is it now, Sheriff?" "We're just heading home. We got a telegram from the authorities in Nebraska." The man said, "A man fitting your description is wanted for grand theft." Silas felt the world tilt on its axis. "I have never stolen a thing in my life," he said, his voice iron. "They say a farmhand ran off with a prize horse and a bag of gold right around the time you vanished from your county." "That wasn't me," Silas roared, his frustration boiling over. "I walked every mile to this state. Look at my feet." The sheriff didn't look down. He only looked at his prey. "We have to take you in until the circuit judge arrives to verify." "No," May screamed from the back of the wagon. She jumped up and threw her small arms around Silas's neck. Clara stood up, looking like a warrior queen of the plains. "This is a lie and a farce," she shouted at the crowd. "He has been working my land for months. He hasn't left my sight. Step down, Silas," the sheriff ordered, drawing his weapon. Silas looked at May, who was sobbing into his shirt. He looked at Clara, who was trembling with a white, hot rage. He knew he couldn't fight a dozen armed men. He wouldn't risk a stray bullet hitting his daughter. He slowly, painfully climbed down from the wagon seat. The men swarmed him, pinning his arms behind his back. They shoved him toward the dark, cramped town jail. "I'll take care of her, Silas," the Clara screamed as they dragged him away. "I promise you, I won't let them touch her." The heavy iron door slammed shut with a finality that felt like death. Silas was plunged into a damp, freezing darkness. He sat on the narrow wooden bench, his head in his hands. He felt a soul, deep sense of despair. Was this the end of his long, bloody journey? After all the miles, the hunger, and the grief, the world simply didn't want a man like him to find peace. Hours crawled by like insects on the wall. Back in town, Clara refused to leave. She demanded the telegraph operator send another message to Nebraska. "Check again. Someone made a mistake." The operator sighed, but he sent it anyway. The sun went down and the jail became a tomb of cold air. Suddenly, he heard the heavy thud of boots. The sheriff appeared at the bars looking sour and annoyed. "You're a lucky man, Thorn," he muttered, fumbling with the keys. "What happened?" Silas asked, his voice cracked. "Another telegram came through an hour ago. They caught the real thief in Casper. He had the horse and the gold." Silas stood up, his body aching from the tension. He didn't say a single word to the man who had humiliated him. He walked out of the jail and into the crisp night air. The street was empty, the wagon was gone. His heart sank into the freezing mud of the street. Had the town finally broken Clara's spirit? Had she realized he wasn't worth the trouble he brought? He started to walk toward the ranch, 10 long miles away. He didn't care if his feet bled through his boots again. He would walk across the entire world to find them. But then, he heard a familiar rhythmic sound. The click, clop of a horse, and the creak of a heavy axle. A small lantern flickered in the darkness like a fallen star. The wagon pulled up. The horses stood low, headed and exhausted. Clara was driving, her face set in a grim, determined mask. May was fast asleep on the seat beside her, wrapped in the quilt. Clara stopped the wagon and looked at Silas. She didn't offer a platitude or ask if he was all right. She simply reached out her hand, palm up. Silas took it, and the warmth of her skin flooded his soul. It was the hand of a partner, an equal, and a savior. "Let's go home, Silas," she said, her voice soft as velvet. Halfway home, May woke for a moment. She reached out with sleepy little hands. One hand found Silas. The other found Clara. She fell asleep holding both. The drive back to the ranch was a holy silence. The stars were a canopy of light over the Wyoming plains. The Big Dipper hung low, guiding them through the dark. When they arrived, Silas carried May into the house. He tucked her into the bed with the scrap fabric quilt. He watched her sleep for a long, quiet time. She was his daughter by blood and Clara's daughter by choice. The bargain was no longer a contract written in desperation. It was a living, breathing reality. Silas walked into the kitchen, where a single candle burned. Clara was sitting at the wooden table waiting for him. "I thought you wouldn't come back for me," Silas admitted. "I thought you'd be better off with the shadow I cast." Clara looked at him, the candle flame dancing in her eyes. "I told you once before, Silas Thorne. I was an empty house in a dead winter. You and that girl filled the rooms with life again. I don't care about the rumors or the trouble in town. I don't care if the whole world stands against us." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I want more than just a daughter now, Silas." Silas felt his breath hitch in his chest. He looked at this magnificent, iron-willed woman. She had saved his child's life and she had saved his spirit. "I'm just a drifter with nothing to my name but my word," he whispered. "You have everything I will ever need," Clara replied. Neither of them moved. The silence lasted several heartbeats. Then Clara smiled through tears. Silas stood up and walked around the small table. He took her hands and pulled her to her feet. In the profound quiet of the Wyoming night, he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of fleeting passion nor youthful fire. It was a kiss of promise, of survival, and of deep respect. It was the union of two souls who had survived the storm. The winter of 1888 arrived with a terrifying roar. It was a brutal, relentless season that broke lesser spirits. The snow piled high against the windows, blocking the light. The wind howled like a wounded beast across the plains. But inside the ranch house, the fire never went out. There was plenty of seasoned wood, and plenty of food in the cellar. And for the first time in their lives, there was an abundance of love. Silas and Clara were married by a traveling preacher in the spring. May wore a dress made of the fine blue wool Clara had bought. She was the flower girl, the light of their lives. Everyone in Medicine Bow stood to watch. Many remembered the day the stranger first walked into town, carrying his little girl. Now, no one called him a drifter anymore. She was the daughter they both cherished above all else. Years later, people still spoke of the man who came from the trail. They talked about the widow who had the courage to take him in. But they didn't speak with malice or judgment anymore.